negotiation with the Taliban is an issue that has been much in the press of late, and coverage has probably run much farther than facts on the ground so far have warranted. The issue itself, in terms of what negotiations mean, those foundational questions haven't been answered as of yet. When, how, with whom, what are we talking about? And so I hope that today's panel can perhaps shed some light on what this should mean, because we're still in a process and a stage where these questions have not been answered in any way definitively. So we'll first turn to Gilles Dorronsoro, and he'll get us started.
Thank you. A lot of things have been said. So I'm going to try to give you my thought about an agreement and negotiation in Afghanistan right now. Of course, it's pessimistic. It's my own personal brand. I see three possibilities, logically. First, no agreement, because the coalition wins the war, or kind of win the war. Anyway, the Kabul government is able to stand alone, and so we can withdraw without an agreement. The second possibility, logically, is to have a real agreement, a real political agreement with the Taliban. That is a government of coalition in Kabul. And the third possibility is what I would call a fake agreement, a short-term agreement. Think about, for example, Vietnam '73. I mean, the agreement in Paris, and then 2 years after, of course, it's all over. That could be the third solution. So, what is likely? What is not likely? What are the consequences of all that? The first situation would be no agreement. And that's the current position of the US government. Means that what is called an agreement, actually, is that the Taliban should give up their arms, respect the constitution, and be nice guys forever. Okay, that's, of course, not going to happen. But that's the official line of the US government. At the same time, you have the second idea that Karzai should be in charge of the negotiation. And that's two key points that makes any kind of diplomatic solution impossible. So that we are going to see that. The first thing is that the trend currently is in favor of the Taliban in Afghanistan. There is no change in the momentum. The problem in Afghanistan is that you have a lot of wishful thinking based on local anecdotes. And Afghanistan is a big country. You can always find a village where things are going not so bad. While it's coming difficult, because it's going difficult to go to villages, but still you can find a village. And I'm afraid of something, is that the current conversation about Afghanistan is too much about a few districts in the south. What should be clear for everybody is that even if the current military operation in the south works, and I don't think it's going to work, but even if it works, the momentum is still in favor of the Taliban. Because what we have seen in 2010 is the Taliban becoming, really, I think, a national movement. They are almost everywhere. Okay, they are not in Panjshir, they are not in Hazarajat, but they are mostly a national movement. Yes, they are mostly a Pashtun movement, but you find Uzbek, you find local communities who are working with the Taliban, not necessarily for ideological reasons, but for other reasons. And that makes the current situation basically impossible to change in the long run. What makes military victory against the Taliban totally impossible is the fact that they have the full support of the Pakistani military. And I don't see any reason why it should change the next 2 years. Yeah. The operation in South Waziristan or in Bajor Agency, whatever, were not directed, of course, against the Afghan Taliban. Plus, even if the Pakistani army wanted to fight against the Afghan Taliban, I don't think they have enough troops, except if they take more troops from the Indian front, the Indian border, which is not extremely likely, you have to admit. So we are in a situation where the Taliban are a long-term player in the political landscape in Afghanistan. That's a reality. So the idea of victory is not very realistic. What we have now, it's another idea actually, is the idea that with a lot of time, because now it's not even 2014, it's now 2017, 2020, the real deadline. With a lot of time, we can build a solid Afghan national army, will be able to contain the Taliban. I see two problems with that. First problem is that nothing, absolutely nothing indicates that the Afghan National Army will ever be able just to contain the Taliban in most of the provinces. All the information we have goes the other way. Think about Lahman the last summer. It's a clear demonstration that it takes a lot of time to have officers. And officers are the key in the army, not the soldiers, the officers. We don't have enough officers, and I don't think it could work reasonably. The second point, which is extremely important, is that if the end game is to have a government in Kabul, which would be basically like the Najibullah's government at the end of the 80s, beginning of the 90s, it's not going to cover the security question on the Afghan-Pakistani border. So basically, we are going to finance a government who is in control of no region that are of strategic interest for the United States. Means if Al-Qaeda wants to be back in Afghanistan, Al-Qaeda will be back in Afghanistan, they can have training camp, they can have whatever they want. So I don't see that as a very, very good solution. Whatever, which is worse, is that the situation currently is not such that you can even think about a beginning of withdrawal. What's going to happen the next 2-3 years is that the Europeans are leaving. Whatever we think about the Europeans as fighting forces in Afghanistan, the fact is that we will need to replace them. And concretely what I am saying is that next September, October, November, some people are going to say, well, actually, we need more troops in Afghanistan. More US troops in Afghanistan. That's the logical consequences of less Europeans and more Taliban. I think it's a kind of political problem, if I'm reading the situation well. And that could be, I mean, we'll discuss that later. But obviously, the idea that we start withdrawing after July 2011 is not going to work. So, yes, we need a deal. We need a deal, and you have two kinds of deal, basically, and the best would be a government of coalition. Why? Because actually the Taliban are mostly a national movement and a nationalist movement. Their relationship with Al-Qaeda is weak. We can make a deal with them. There is no big problem with dealing with the Taliban. And if we make a deal with the Taliban, we can do counter-terrorism. The problem with the Biden option is that there was an elephant in the room that everybody managed to go around and never touch. Is that counter-terrorism means a deal with the Taliban to get the Taliban out of the picture, which is doable locally. Now, so what are the problems with a government of coalition? The main problem we have is that we are not back to the 90s. Means Karzai is extremely weak. Karzai is not Najibullah, sadly enough. Karzai is not able to represent, yeah, sadly enough, well, to a certain extent. Karzai is not able to represent Hazara people from the SB Wadat. He has very bad relationship with Ustad Attad in Mazar-e-Sharif, bad relationship with Dostum now. Of course, no support at all in the Pashtun areas. And so what is Karzai able to represent in a negotiation? And my answer would be not much. So the second option would be to have not only Karzai, but other players coming from Panjshir, coming from the northwest, Uzbek, whatever, to deal with the Taliban. But that supposes at least two things. First, that Karzai is slightly put out of the negotiation. At least he should not be the only representative of Afghanistan in the negotiation, which is not easy deal. Second, that you'd be able to convince people from the north, let's say, to speak quickly, people from the north to participate in the negotiation, which is not a given. And third, of course, that the United States should be part of the negotiation. If you want a negotiation, a solid negotiation in Afghanistan right now, you need to have the United States part of the process. The idea that you're not just giving a few planes for the transportation of the Taliban leadership from Quetta to Kabul is clearly not sufficient. So, is that going to work? No, most probably no. The government of coalition, a real political negotiation, isn't going to work. Why? Because first, the United States is not going to buy that option. Clearly, there is a clear opposition from the US military at least, and even beyond that, to the idea of negotiating with the Taliban leadership. We are still in the fantasy that we are going to break the Taliban in little pieces and swallow the little pieces. It's a dream, it's never going to happen, everybody knows it on the ground, but it's still the official line. And second, Obama is not going to take any risk before the presidential election. So basically, we are in a situation where my bet, and I hope very much I am wrong, my bet is that nothing is going to move before 2012. 2012, the situation will most likely be a disaster on the ground, and nobody can be sure that the Taliban and de facto the Pakistani army will buy a negotiation. I'm not sure at all. It's too far to predict anything. And last option, it's what I call a fake agreement, short-term agreement, Vietnam-like agreement, if you want. The idea that we have the possibility to exit Afghanistan just because we need an agreement, actually, the same way the Soviet left Afghanistan with an agreement, if everything else failed. And that is more and more the likely outcome of the current situation. And here, the idea that it's possible to withdraw and to divide the country north against south is running into very, very deep difficulties. First, because if you try to divide Afghanistan, you could have very much ethnic cleansing, which is not a good thing for moral reason and for political and strategic reason. Second, you're destabilizing Pakistan a lot. And third, even doing that, you still don't have an answer to your question being how to avoid Afghanistan being again a base for a radical jihadist movement. So I would say that the main problem we have now is not on the ground, it's in Washington. It's how do you say, stop, this war is too costly, it's not in the national interest, when you have the political situation you have in Washington, where there is an overreaction to any kind of slightly terrorist incident. The overreaction is killing us, literally. Yeah. Where it's not possible politically to say to people, there is a level of risk that we have to accept because life is like that. And zero risk means infinite cost. Yeah, that's the problem. If you want zero risk, the cost is incredibly high. So for all this reason, The most likely is that the next 18 months, 2 years is not going to do anything very positive. Then, if Obama is re-elected, he will probably be in a better situation to do something. If it's a new president, I'm afraid that he will have ideas, and then we are going to lose 1 year or 2 years more. Thank you.
Okay. This is encouraging, actually, because I thought I wasn't going to have any common ground with Gilles, who was a pessimist. But in fact, actually, there's a lot of convergences. I should say that as somebody currently serving in the State Department, the views I express are not necessarily those of the United States government, and they are my own. You know, the first thing is, as we discuss Taliban, I just want to sort of frame the issue for folks again, emphasizing that I thought the term movement was more appropriate, because what you don't see, and I was over with Colonel George in the East, and we were particularly in Nangarhar, Nuristan, Kunar, and Logman, which is a discrete geographic area, is that this is a coherent, cohesive, you know, political entity, the Taliban. In fact, there were very few people that would, you know, there were a lot of people that were called Taliban, but people had very divergent affiliations throughout that area. So when you start to talk about who you're negotiating with, I mean, it is a question which our moderator raised right at the beginning. Who exactly is that? And I think everybody needs to take that into account. That means that the style and type of negotiation that you're going to do is going to rely on a different set of interlocutors, and one set of interlocutors based in Quetta or elsewhere delivering the Taliban is basically not going to be possible. So what you're going to have is a much more you know, a much more nuanced and broad conversation with a lot of different people. But the key is all of these other factions, these other criminal networks that are out there, and then really understanding that a lot of the conflict is locally driven. And so again, one of the things that Gilles identified is that not everything is ideological. And it is in areas that the conflict is not ideological, that it may be straight political or economic in nature, that we have the opportunity to explore a way forward. And I think that's very important for folks to understand, because it's only the very narrow ideological conflict against the West, you know, in support of transnational sub-state actors, that is, you know, our red line. And so the big thing is that, you know, local accommodation and community equities have to be taken into account. So, you know, in the areas that we were operating, I'll discuss this just a little bit more in depth, you know, people had some basic asks of how they were able to better interact with their own government. And finding ways to address those concerns can mitigate conflict in a way and create some traction for the state that will be drawn in sharp contrast with what the Taliban is trying to put out. In order for any sort of negotiations on reconciliation or reintegration to be successful, though, the relationship between the center and the periphery is going to have to be better defined, and the narratives are going to have to be synchronized. And what I mean by that is what is happening in Kabul in terms of reconciliation is not necessarily what's happening at the district level, and we've got to find a way to make sure that the districts are on the same page as the province, which is on the same page as Kabul. And in terms of the narratives, you know, is it a political war? Is it an ideological war? And who is the war against? So, you know, as one example of that, soldiers who are serving in the Afghan government, in the Afghan National Army, expressed concern to us that they said, look, every day we are fighting folks that are ideologically aligned with the Taliban, and then we see that the negotiation is all about the Taliban and not necessarily about our local concerns, and that concerns us because we're trying to support the state. And so that narrative has to come together. And then the last point, I actually agree with Gilles again, is that you know, red lines remain for the West in terms of the affiliation with Al-Qaeda or other groups. And so that will have to be taken into account. But all of that adds up to elements that make up a negotiation strategy. So, I think that while it's very easy to sit back and say, okay, nothing is working and everything's falling apart, actually, if you do have those elements in place, and if people are considering them, which in fact they are, you do have the opportunity to move forward. And that change can happen very quickly on the ground. I think that, in highly kinetic environments, people can it's very easy to get pessimistic. You see a lot of people dying, you see a lot of problems, but wars do end, and the way they end is often through negotiation. I just want to give folks a little bit of a sense of what the current structure is, because in Afghanistan, the way ISAF and the Afghan government have defined reconciliation and reintegration is a bit different than other parts of the world. It's not a traditional DDRR structure. They've literally come up with a definition where reconciliation is high level between the Karzai government and, let's say Taliban or others. And reintegration is really everybody who's not a senior decision maker and is a mid-level commander. And in fact, ISAF's guidance to troops is to support Afghan government efforts at reintegration on the ground. So I would distinguish a little bit when you say that the military is absolutely against any sort of negotiations on the ground and is looking for some sort of kinetic military victory. In fact, it's a much more pragmatic approach, and that's part of what defines the counterinsurgency strategy. This two-tiered approach, however, requires some caution, because there have been a lot of disarmament programs in Afghanistan over the last 10 years, including the disarmament of illegal armed groups effort, and several other efforts that have been put forward. The challenge there is that ordinarily in a wartime situation, you have some sort of peace settlement, some sort of political accommodation, and then that's followed by a reconciliation process. In other words, reconciliation is the process of, after you've agreed to stop shooting, you're bringing folks back into the government. And that's usually paired with a DDRR process. Where you actually have specific armed groups, and then they're demobilized, disarmed, rehabilitated, and reintegrated. And those, sometimes one happens and the other doesn't happen. It really depends on the nature of the conflict. In Afghanistan, the challenge is they're trying to do several of these things at once. So they're actually trying to do a reintegration program or put it forward while in a kinetic war. And we don't have the full political settlement yet. And I think that's a bit of a challenge in how you implement, because what happens is some folks want to move forward with programs, and it's not going to take a programmatic end to the war. The other thing is that what we're also dealing with is a conflict that is really characterized by ambivalence toward the state. And the challenge is getting communities fully vested in the state and fully supporting in the state. And that's where, Colonel George talked about whether it's tribal engagement or local engagement, bringing various constituencies that may feel that they don't have or are not receiving the benefits of participation, bringing them back into the political discourse. And when that kind of initiative happens, you have a far better chance that they will not take a purely ideological view of the war. And so solutions exist for making that happen. One is, I know local or village elections are somewhat down the line, but that is something that is slated for the future. The district election process, understanding grievances, and finding ways to mitigate the challenges that are raised when people disagree with appointments in the unitary state system, and understanding the grievances coming out of communities and forcefully and quickly addressing them gives you an opportunity to provide a more responsive government. So, again, solutions are out there. It's a question of the commitment to follow through. And then, finally, there's also understanding the localized nature of the conflict. In a lot of cases, it has to do with revenue streams. So, in places like Kunar, you have timber, gems, and other sources of revenue that the central government essentially is looking to make sure that, one, those are controlled for, obvious environmental reasons, but the other reason is, of course, folks are trying to get a handle on that revenue stream. Finding ways to address local concerns so that people who work in those industries, who work on timber, or who trade in gems, are able to benefit from that without being in conflict with the state, is something that can be done, and it's something that people are working on. So again, there are avenues to tamp down conflict, and then that, in a circumstance like that, and we've seen this in places like Nuristan, people are then less inclined to look to an outsider, an ideological person coming in, such as a Taliban who's crossed over from Pakistan and decides that he wants to establish himself in a particular area, and more likely to look to their own resources and their own relationship with the government. A couple examples of this that we saw. In one case was up in Nuristan. It was an area that we've gotten into conflict with Hague in the past, and there was a mullah up there that we had actually been in active conflict with, and part of that has to do with the nature of our relationships with various folks in the center, and over time it became clear that he did not want to go the route of the Taliban, and at least signal to us that there was a willingness to potentially break from, transnational terrorism. And in that case, it opens up an opportunity for us to go in and re-engage. And what were the asks? The asks on his side were both for the U.S. military, one, to stop targeting him, okay, but that required concurrence also with the Afghan military and everything. But the second thing is actually putting, having some input from his local shura into who gets to be, the line minister for education, who gets to be the sub-governor, who's the police chief. And it's very easy to write this off as, well, that's warlordism, and that's a return to warlordism. But at the same time, the alternatives are that folks that are funded and financed by exogenous forces and have an ideological disposition very much against the international effort come into that area and take over some of that area. And the interesting thing is that to support somebody like that does not necessarily require a large military presence. It doesn't require robust, even a development agenda. What it requires is to try to, again, connect what the center is doing with what's going on out in the periphery and make sure that they're understanding and hearing those concerns and relaying that back. And that's sort of, there's a counterinsurgency element to it, but it's also classic diplomacy. But what it does is it takes us out of the conflict and it puts us in a more facilitative role. And interestingly, what I saw when I was over there for a year is a lot of people were not fully against the international effort. In fact, they were quite favorable to our involvement. What they didn't like, though, was a lot of elements that were happening in their own government, and they felt that we were also misusing our resources and things like that. So understanding where those concerns are coming from is a way to advance the effort. Similarly, Nangarhar, can easily be, it is the prize for the east of Afghanistan. You've got Jalalabad, you have the Khyber Pass, you have a huge amount of resources and wealth flowing through that area. In Jalalabad, there's a lot of different equities there. There's a lot of different interests. There's business communities, there's trade, there's tribal interests and agriculture. And all of that comes together, which gives people a reason not to necessarily perpetuate conflict. And in a lot of ways, you could argue, okay, that's probably why the Momand have generally chosen to side with the government. They're getting more benefit by being part of the state than being in opposition to it. Same thing with the Shinwari. And the Khojiani, though, have had more of a difficult relationship because there has been a return of some of the poppy crops and things like that. But I would contest that, poppy is the only way to make money. There's a lot of different ways to make money, and it's making sure that people have access to that. And again, you can look at things like local revenue generation and taxation, and changes like that can show that the state is more responsive. So the possibility is out there. So again, the final thing, though, I want to say is that for us to continue to make progress, it means to make sure that we're not involved in parochial disputes that we shouldn't be involved in. Make sure that we're not siding with folks that really are not aligned against us, but are aligned against each other, and we're not getting played off of themselves. And that has happened in the past, and I think we have a far better understanding on the ground of that now, that we don't necessarily need to be involved in every land dispute. But what we can do is help listen and connect that back to the center. And then, again, synchronizing the narratives, making sure that if we're doing reintegration efforts on the ground, and there is a Mullah Sadek out there, or a Maftoon, or other players out there that are local characters that have local influence, and we want to dialogue with them, and we want the Afghan government on the ground to dialogue with them, that there's political support back in Kabul. Because there's a lot of different interests, as people have talked about. The Northern Alliance and other folks have their equities, the Pashtun have their equities, but that discussion is taking place, and that's why I don't think you can look at it and say that it's all about to come apart. All of these different interests are there, and in fact, the one thing we can say is that the country is. People say, well, there's only 38% literacy, and there's all that. All of those things, though, have advanced significantly in the last 10 years. I mean, the time that it takes to get to medical treatment from northern Kunar down to Jalalabad has been, cut significantly. The roads are there. The trade is there. The opportunity for economic progress. And then there's a lot more in the world with the globalization of small trade things. So opportunities exist out there for negotiation, and we'll see how it plays out.
Move to this. Hello, everyone. I mean, it'd be a disaster at this time of day if we find the panel agreeing with each other. So if I don't directly want to contradict my esteemed colleagues, I guess I can say it differently. So as they've been so eloquent, I can start with a cliche. And the cliche I wanted to start with was, in time-honored fashion, taking us back to the asymmetry of 19th century and early 20th century warfare in the same area where warfare is being played out today. And remember, you can remember which cliche I'm talking about. I'm talking about arithmetic on the frontier. Remember it? Most people should remember it. It's a scrimmage on a border station, a canter down a dark defile, £2,000 of education drops to a 10-rupee Giselle. The crammers boast the squadron's pride, shot like a rabbit in a ride. Now, what was the imbalance? The imbalance there, the amount of investment that went into a British officer and the amount of money it took to make a homemade Giselle, a rifle to shoot him with. To keep us awake, I wanted to start off with a question. Again, somebody mentioned earlier on this is a university. If we're just thinking in terms of asymmetries today, I mean, the Taliban are at the moment the enemy, and there are round about 10,000 of the enemy in the field fighting against the US and all the US's allies. How much does it cost us per enemy per year? How many zeros? Just again, good arithmetic, mental arithmetic. How many zeros per enemy for us to take on? How many zeros? One. Yeah, okay. 7. 7 zeros. $10 million per enemy is the annual investment with the current approach and with the current choice of enemy. So moving from cliche to question. To confession. The confession is, I've got to sign up. I've got to sign up in the optimist camp. However, I'm one of those optimists who actually goes around with a few reasons for his optimism. Obviously, the basic optimism that I'm offering is that it is possible to achieve an Afghanistan which is peaceful, stable, and not an imminent threat to anybody. And an outcome which broadly would be good for the people of Afghanistan, for the people of the region, and the people of the United States. Of the various factors that we can call into play for this optimism, the first is if you sound out multiple constituencies around Afghanistan, despite the fairly appalling situation and trajectory, I mean, the idea of peace actually has an awful lot of takers. I do not believe that there is an empirical basis to any assertion that the Afghans are okay with perpetual conflict. There is a strong constituency for peace, but at the moment it does obviously not manage to have adequate leverage on the political and military developments in the country. And along with this general sentiment for peace, that I think if you went out there, you can get plenty of indicators to come up with it. The idea of Afghanistan itself, you got multiple references saying that the idea of Afghanistan itself, despite 30 years of conflict, is very strong. There is no strong constituency in Afghanistan which is against the idea of Afghanistan or in favor of something which would look like breakup. There's also, in terms of ideas of governance, ideas of the state. There's not too much zero sum out there, and many of the, we hear lots of people talking about a desire for a strong central state, but then it's also combined with actual ideas for forms of local autonomy, which more about achieving justice at the local area and not really expecting too much state interference in achieving that. In other words, in terms of what you're dealing with in terms of many people's ideas are compatible with the end state that I think that many of us would like to achieve. There's also the issue, of course, which on our today's panel to do with the Taliban. The people that we've chosen as our $10 million each enemy. Have been systematically misportrayed over the past few years as far more of a threat than they actually are. They're not actually quite as dangerous as we have had to portray them so as to sustain the narrative for the current stage of the conflict. And significantly, earlier on we talked about rebranding of Pakistan. Rebranding the Taliban is perhaps not quite as difficult. I do not think that this should not be taken as a sort of a head in the stanza position. That we should acknowledge that currently the Taliban movement represents the main force inside the armed opposition in arms against a government which arose out of a United Nations-backed process, a process which I certainly would contend had a great deal of support on the ground inside Afghanistan, and which, in pragmatic terms, is supported by the United States. So there shouldn't be any surprise that currently the Taliban are the enemy and are being fought against. I think there is nothing inevitable about it, and that the final bit of optimism, or the basis for the optimism, is this one of these rare planetary alignments that astronomers hang out for decades to get, when we find that the fiscal argument and the idealist argument aligns, because broadly, to achieve the acceptable and attainable end state which I've been talking about, rather less money is going to be required than more, and probably less boots on the ground rather than more. There's going to be a lot of subtlety, a lot of politics, a certain amount of agony, and it may take quite a while, but broadly, the idealist position fortunately costs less. And given that the current economic circumstances and those projected for the next few years, that argument may end up counting for rather more in coming years than in previous years. So, going from trying to obviously to go from a broad position of idealist and broad ideas of why we should be there. If we are trying to tackle the issue of the Taliban and how do we get them out of their privileged $10 million position, I mean, there's a sort of a Talibanology has been developing over the past few years. People are trying to to grapple with the issue of what on earth they are about, and how do we use this knowledge about what they are about to inform what has to be done. So, I mean, if we had all day, I've got a list as long as your arm of the kind of interesting questions one could ask about the Taliban and reach conclusions about what is to be done. I mean, I'd only get through a couple of them, but of course we generally start with asking, broadly, what is it do the Taliban want? And quite often you can just get onto a website when you want to work out what a movement is about, and you read the thing and you memorize it and that's it. But of course, the thing is that it's not quite as simple as that, because the Taliban is far more than just a simply hierarchically organized movement that you look at the top of the hierarchy and that tells you what the whole movement is about. That even when you talk to Taliban foot soldiers, whereas, I mean, in reality they exercise a fair degree of autonomy in the areas where they operate, they say, but we do listen to what our official spokesman says, and it does influence us some way. So, basically, in trying to understand, there is a sort of a stargazing game involved in trying to work out what the Taliban are about, and there's no single text, and there's no authoritative text which you can say really defines what drives the movement, because there is an awful lot of position play, and a lot of what is put out in the airwaves and the propaganda is convenient there as part of the informational war, but does not really define what actually is driving the conflict. So, there's a complex basis as how you arrive at these things. But I think some of the things that I think we could justify in saying that the Taliban do actually stand for is that they do stand for foreign troops out. And lots of evidence. I mean, just whether you look at the propaganda they put out at the top, or whether you look to people down at the bottom who are actually doing the fighting, this certainly does come out there. Of course, one of the reasons for alignment is that probably converges with probably quite a few of the people in this room and many of the decision makers in Washington and other Western capitals. But I mean, still, the movement does have an awful lot to do with wanting foreign troops out. Although in many of their official positions they don't really spell out what it means operationally, clearly the movement is something about the attainment of an ideal Islamic society. They've generally, despite the fact that in another era when they were in power, one clique pursued a very interesting project in building an Islamic state. Most of them didn't know much about the legislative program. And I don't think we can really say that that's what drives the current fighters. But even when you look both at members of the leadership and with people on the ground, there are ideas of justice are driving it. And when they express those ideas of justice, they always put an Islamic label. I mean, because there's a sort of an assumption of convergence that inherently a just society is bound to be an Islamic society. That's if you look from the perspective of Kandahar or Nangarhar, east of Afghanistan or west of Afghanistan. Those things are more obviously synonymous than when you're looking from a New York or a Washington perspective. Along with justice in their idea of the Islamic society that they're striving for, there's something to do with public piety. I mean, that the society that we're striving for, which would be just, should also look Islamic. I mean, people should be saying their prayers and so on. Public piety will be observed. And again, they don't actually express this in any propaganda piece or in any piece of writing, but this is something which is more or less, it's a political cum anthropological observation. They stand for respect for the clergy, at least their brand of the clergy. Clearly, I mean, those clergy who become collaborators, I mean, they take them on ruthlessly and kill them, but the movement has sprung out of a tradition of saying, we the clergy are the vanguard of the right kind of politics. Also, as is clear in much of their local politics and some of their public stances, and even in some of their propaganda, they stand broadly against corruption, even against the illegal accumulation of wealth. I mean, funnily enough, many of the statements that we get, whether in WikiLeaks or the New York Times or whatever, are statements which, they're generally attributed to US diplomats, but I mean, if we did a Taliban WikiLeaks, we could probably actually get them saying many of the same things themselves. They avoid articulating this in in writing, but it's clear from the discourse. And if you sit down, sit down with the people who actually count inside the movement, guess what? It's not just that, sort of like sociologically speaking, they are Pashtuns, that the movement tends to assert the primacy of Pashtuns in Afghan politics. And there are ideas of trying to redress the unnatural imbalance which has arisen over the past few years, that with many Pashtuns believing that somehow they have been displaced relative to their natural equilibrium. I think that if I had to come up with a phrase that sort of summed up who the Taliban are politically, it would be that they are the clerical wing of traditional Pashtun nationalism, which probably isn't terribly terrifying, actually. Because the next part is clearly they are Afghan nationalist. And Afghan nationalist, at least as expressed by this traditional, this clerical part of traditional Pashtun nationalism, is about, they generally would, their political instincts are in favor of some kind of role for central government. Anybody who says anything nice and well informed about decentralization and federalism, instinctively they're against it, although they might not have many clear ideas about what to do about it. But clearly they're in favor of the notion of central government, and that they tend to be highly sensitive about foreign interference and foreign presence in Afghanistan. But this is not from a 21st century revival of anti-US stance. This is something inherited from 19th century Afghan politics, before the United States was a force in the area. Suspicion about any foreign involvement in Afghanistan. It's a traditional political instinct, rather something which has emerged out of the global jihad. And in the politics of today, of course, they are they're sort of anti-collaborationists. Anybody who's involved in clear association with the United States engagement in Afghanistan, then currently the Taliban have to be against them and position themselves as being against them, and can lambast people for their proximity to the international project inside Afghanistan. So, although the kind of things that they're in favor doesn't make them terribly easy people to deal with if you are either a non-Talib in Afghan politics, or if you're an international player trying to work out, now that we've got in, how do we achieve some kind of stability. But at least in terms of the basic thing, they don't necessarily merit that $10 million position. This establishes them as Afghan political actors par excellence, but not permanent enemies of the United States. One of the issues that we had cropping up earlier on, and I see I'm going to be not going to go on to the whole list of questions, but we did at least have the issue before lunch about what about the point that the Taliban are not a monolithic organization, and what are the implications of this for reconciliation strategy? And of course, if you think back to people's description of how the Taliban are organized at the moment, they'll give you the Quetta Shura, and what was we had the initials, it was KST, yeah, okay. So the KST, Quetta, the Quetta Shura, they are the original Taliban movement formed in 1994, led by Mullah Umar, based upon a political heritage that went back at least to 1978, when young men who were the young generation of clerics became some of the vanguard of the jihad against the communists and then against the Soviets, and later on coalesced as a formally declared political movement and took over the country. And that's one part of the Taliban movement. And in a sense, they really are important. And the reason that people refer to the insurgency and the Taliban as almost synonymous, although the fine-tuned descriptions say they're not, is because that movement did actually capture most of the country, was internationally very visible, and can have a claim to have been trying to build an Islamic state. And so, in a sense, they're important not just as movement, in which you can decide whether whether someone belongs to a movement or doesn't belong to a movement, supports a movement or doesn't. They're important as the holders of a brand. That they are the symbol of those who were thrown out by the Americans and will now fight back, and who have striven for achieving an Islamic society. Now, if I were the legal advisor to the Quetta Shura, I would actually be talking to the leadership at the moment, and I would be saying, we really have to watch our intellectual property rights. In fact, I think we really have to contemplate legal action against the Haqqani network. Because in terms of significance in Afghan politics, I mean, the Taliban movement, they're from the same place where in 1747 the Afghan state was born. They are they are members of tribes, even if they tend to be poor boys from those tribes, but tribes who've got a well-known place in politics, who can each of which tribe can remember those of their tribe who have held significant power positions in Afghan politics. The Haqqanis are hillbillies. I mean, they're people from an insignificant border tribe that only ever plays a role in Afghan politics temporarily during times of crisis, and never plays a significant role in actually governing the country. And yet, over the past year or two, there's been this attempt by the people sitting in the Haqqani network and their backers to appropriate brand Talib, except they're gradually easing out of the word Talib and they're going back to Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan. So they're trying to sort of create an image that we can be a movement which tries to take over Afghanistan and is not actually driven by the people who led the movement in 1994. Now, all this is sort of like great stuff for the analysts who are trying to work out what's going on. There actually are some very significant implications for those people who say, okay, probably the way forward is helping the Taliban out of the $10 million position into not being enemies of the United States and probably being partners in some kind of a solution. It is quite possible that some kind of deal, of the kind of thing that Gilles was saying, might not be impossible, might not be unattainable. That some of the original leadership of the Kandahari Taliban, some of those people who were part of that movement, sufficient to actually say that we are the Taliban movement, not the rump, not a split part of it, not a few people brought in in the dead of night through in a NATO aircraft, but actually the Taliban movement are actually part of this process. That it is conceivable if the kind of deal which Gilles is saying, not easy, not on the current trajectory, but might actually happen, that if the Taliban movement actually owned the process because they were convinced that it was actually in keeping with what they stood for as a movement, and was not actually leading to the legitimation of the presence of foreign troops, but actually leading towards the end of the foreign troop presence, but to some kind of negotiated way as to how Afghans would live inside the same state, and how they would relate to the international community, and how they would probably cooperate in rebuilding the country. It is possible that in that kind of deal that the other parts of the current insurgency would be against it. And so, that's about how you structure the deal, how you structure the engagement, what happens afterwards, and also accepting that it's possible that something which would look like a deal wouldn't instantly achieve peace, but would be an important milestone on the way to peace, and would be the start of the process of solving this riddle of the $10 million enemy, of turning people who are currently the sequels of that 10 rupee Giselle, in a sense engaging them as social capital, the kind of taking on some of the the values and their ability to mobilize people to make the process succeed rather than end the process. But I mean, I think the final implication that you get from it is that what happens in the intra-Taliban, intra-insurgent politics does actually have significance for whether you make progress on stability or not. And the bad old days where we sort of treated all insurgents the same, we're probably never going to get us out there. But there's going to have to be a lot more subtlety of politics as you go forward. And I mean, I personally have observed over the past year, I've been amazed at whereas some of our friends have talked about how Al-Qaeda has no presence in Afghanistan. In some parts of the insurgency, the nexus between international militants, the Pakistani Taliban movement and Afghan insurgents has grown stronger rather than weaker. The number of non-Afghan elements actively engaged in the insurgency has increased, not reduced. And broadly, I think that the more that happens, the more difficult it is to achieve stability and to enable Taliban social capital to be deployed in making this thing work than not. So definitely anybody working for stability wants to watch that process and find subtle ways of essentially reversing it, and probably makes you all the more keen to engage the official Taliban, get them on board, and achieve what is, I believe, is achievable, which is a peaceful, stable Afghanistan, which is the best outcome for Afghanistan, the region, and the US.
Well, picking up on this, before I open it up to the floor for questions, you talked about the shifting dynamics within the movement, and there has been some consistent talk about generational shifts to a younger, more radicalized, less politicized cadre of mid-level commanders. Is there a sense that, to any of the panelists, is there a sense that there's a time limit, a window of opportunity that might be missed? Is the sort of dynamics of war going to create a more radicalized movement if there's no serious engagement in the near term?
What Michael was saying actually was a little bit too indirect. I'm going to say more directly what you wanted to say actually, is that if we keep killing the Taliban, who are kind of notable, if we are killing everybody who is over 35 years old because they run less well than the young people, we will have a much more radicalized movement, and that's probably what we are seeing in Kandahar. So there are two different sort of things. There are things we cannot manage, we cannot impact. What's going on in North Waziristan is difficult to do something about. But the current strategy, the way it works, I think is pushing the Taliban in two directions that are bad. First, they are more radicalized, and maybe, just maybe, the central leadership is less able to control its militants. So I'm afraid of that.
So if we could take questions, if you could come to that. Sorry.
I just want to add, look, again, in the East, in the areas that Colonel George and I served, what we did not see was this Taliban movement. There's a lot of people who call themselves Talibs, but the political leaning and the conflict with the state, the Taliban were associated with criminal networks that were doing the drugs. Elsewhere, it was a couple folks that were really trying to assert greater authority in the Kunar area, but the differences within those movements were great. And I actually do think it gets to what Michael had talked about, which is that the overwhelming desire of the people that we encountered was certainly to live within a more secure state, and they did not associate that with Taliban. So that's 4 provinces. I would argue that there were a host more of provinces, and again, I'm not going to speak to the South. I'm not going to speak to the ideological heartland and places like that. But I can say that we can overplay it and give more prominence to this group. And what we really have to understand is, look, if the state is working for the majority of the people, then all the radicalism in the world doesn't really help, because communities themselves will turn away these insurgents. And sometimes they need help doing that, and that's where we can come in and provide assistance. But what we want to make sure is that the grievances with the state itself are addressed. And when those grievances are addressed, then they don't let the Taliban into their communities, or let's call them folks that are ideologically completely against the state.
So we can take some questions. If you could come up to the microphone and state your name and affiliation.
My name is John Koch. I'm a political scientist, but my specialization is East Asia rather than Central Asia. And I have two very simple observations, one of which makes me optimistic, the other makes me pessimistic. On the optimistic side, you have a government which is basically a foreign creation, and it's fighting for some traction. But unlike Vietnam, for example, there's no Viet Cong out there which had popular following. So that makes me optimistic. What makes me pessimistic is I don't see the common ground between the Taliban and the government. I don't think they're speaking the same language. So if the strategy is just simply to keep mowing them down as they come forward and eventually exhausting then you don't really have a negotiating strategy. It's simply a military strategy of extinguishing the enemy, so to speak. So that's the pessimistic side. What is the common glue that is going to produce a successful negotiation? Assuming that this government, because it doesn't really have any competition other than this military force. Thank you.
I think the common glue which will bind this together, if it all works out, is essentially the idea of Afghanistan. That when you want to do the empirics of this, it is important to look at what drives the Taliban, and they have got aspirations which are largely confined to Afghanistan. Of course, they consider many of the other the people who are either in the government or behind the government. They consider them as civil war foes. So that they sort of they accept that we are against them, but they also understand that they are competing for the same space, and that there are a lot of questions about this whole issue of is there any element of war fatigue inside the Taliban, and it's been sometimes overplayed and sometimes underplayed. That they, the zenith of the overplay was sort of around the fake Ahmad Mansour, this notion that the Taliban are so absolutely fed up, they want ready to throw the towel in and negotiate a ceasefire. Now that was overplaying the extent to which there is fatigue. But I know on the basis of multiple discussions with people reasonably well placed inside the movement, that there is a strong tendency inside the movement that does not want to sustain the conflict indefinitely, and is not convinced that they are going to fight their way into control of the whole of the country in the foreseeable future. But these things change, and that the more that it looks as if actually the Karzai government is about to collapse, and so the U.S. strategy is absolutely not going to work, then the more that those people who thought, we actually are going to have to, we're going to have to negotiate our desires for Afghanistan with the other Afghan political players, they take a back seat and let the military fight on, because we'll, guess what, we can negotiate when we're in a stronger position and when we've beaten the Americans. So what holds them together is that they are actually looking at the same political space, and that there are tendencies on both sides which accept we're going to have to share this space. But this particular painting is not yet ready, and there are some on the other side who think they can persuade the Americans to keep on fighting this war indefinitely, and there are some on the Taliban side who do believe that one more push, we can not just push the Americans out, but we can actually subdue all other Afghans.
So why don't we take the next three questions together?
Thank you. My name is Juan. I would like to ask you broadly about what you would consider a potential role for the United Nations through the Special Representative of the Secretary General in any negotiations with the Taliban. And I understand that the answer to this question really depends on what you hope to accomplish with these negotiations. But assuming that the aim of it were to get some sort of Taliban representation in the Karzai government, some sort of way for them to articulate politically their demands as opposed to militarily. Thank you.
My name is Sabir Ibrahimi. I'm a visiting student from New Jersey. First of all, I want the panel to kind of elaborate a little bit more about what do they mean by Talibanism being an Afghan nationalist movement, because I'm Afghan and I didn't believe in that. Secondly, about the grievances of the Afghans and the communities and villages. It is an issue, and it has been realized by the panel. But like a lot of the programs or the projects that are underway in Afghanistan to kind of meet the needs of those communities are short-term, not something sustainable. What are your suggestions for long-term and sustainable development for those communities rather than short-term projects? Because to me as an Afghan, sometimes I see as like bribing that community to just keep quiet for a while, and then once the money is finished, they again start, you know, going back to the Taliban and trying to create problem in order to get more money from you. So, yeah.
I'm Thanasi Kamanis. I teach here and I also write about the Middle East. I'm curious about how you guys assess the natural equilibrium of the Taliban and its other Afghan counterparts. Austin referred in his remarks to his view that left to its own devices, the Taliban would control half of Afghanistan and the Northern Alliance or its successors the rest. In the region I cover, people say things like that a lot that I actually don't think are true. You know, there's received wisdom about how strong Hamas is or how strong the PA is, and people repeat it, but in fact, if you look closely, there's no evidence for it, or it's drastically wrong. So I'm curious, Michael, how you see their actual natural strength and whether it's feasible that they really could win control of the whole country. And then, Dante, I'm curious from the U.S. government perspective, whether there's what the realistic appraisal of how strong our allies are there versus our enemies on the ground. Thanks.
Why don't we start with Gilles and work our way down?
Well, I will start with the second question, actually. When I said that, and I think I'm not the only one saying that the Taliban are a nationalist movement, means first that they have no project outside Afghanistan. I think that's the most important point. Having said that, it's a revolutionary movement. It's a revolution. The Taliban are a revolution. And doesn't mean they are moderate, doesn't just that they are fighting for a certain idea of Afghanistan and for a state. Taliban are obsessed by the state. And if there is a real important moment in the history of the Taliban, it's 96, when they take Kabul. And people are speaking, I spoke also about neo-Taliban, but neo-Taliban, the real neo-Taliban are emerging in 96, when they understand that they can build a state. And they made a lot of progress from 96 to 2001 to build this state. So just to say that. The second is, we have always the same conversation about what are the Taliban? Are the Taliban this very local movement, local grievances, and so on? And it's due to a large part to a problem of scale. Which scale are you choosing to analyze the phenomenon? If you're thinking at a district level, and most of the military and US officials in general are thinking at a district level. That's very interesting. There is very few understanding of the national dynamics. And that's why, for example, in 2008, the North was supposed to be perfectly okay. Why? Because if the Taliban are a local movement and a Pashtun movement, why should you have a problem in Kunduz? It's always the same. And then we see that we have a big problem in Kunduz, in Barlan, in Tara, and so on and so on. So the problem of this local interpretation of the Taliban is that basically you don't understand why things are changing from one year to another year. Why is the movement extending all the time if it's local grievances? And the problem is that the Taliban are a political movement. And that's the key point. Yes, there is local autonomy to the Taliban fighters. Yes, okay. But it's a political movement. They have a political ideology. So addressing the local grievances of the people is not going to solve the question. Because maybe you're going to become Taliban because of local grievances. But when you are inside the Taliban, there is no way back. You have solidarities. You're part of a political movement. So you cannot go back in time. Addressing local grievances is never going to work. It's like the idea that, okay, Taliban fighters are mostly unemployed, so we are going to give a job to every Afghan, and then the Taliban movement is going to disappear. I'm pushing a little far, but that's the problem. Dividing the country is not technically possible. Or you want to what? To displace 2 or 3 million Pashtun people from the north to the south? It doesn't make sense. The political map is such today that the idea that you divide the country and the north is faced is just wrong. The north of Afghanistan is not stable, it's not safe, it's Taliban or other group, it's totally out of control. You cannot take a car from Kabul to Kunduz. That's it. So this is totally out of question. The third point about the UN. The UN doesn't have a very good record in Afghanistan, actually. At the beginning, the UN was supposed, in a way, to reorganize the country, to be kind of a central player for the state building, for a lot of things, and it didn't work very well because the UN basically didn't have the resources. It doesn't have the resources today. What could be the role of the UN now? The role of the UN is important because it's a way for the United States to send somebody negotiate with the Taliban. And very concretely, the UN can give protection to the Taliban leadership in case of negotiation and in case of ceasefire. And so the UN is a key player because it could avoid what nobody wants in Washington, means shake hand with Mullah Omar, especially not Hillary Clinton. So it's a way to diffuse the question of the political sensibilities, and it's extremely useful. So it could be a key player. It's not right now because there is no support from the United States for a negotiation and a solution, political solution. We are still with the dream that we can have local solution in the problem. We cannot, for another reason, is that Pakistan will never accept local solutions, because if you have local solutions, Pakistan is out of the picture. Pakistan will never accept that you're going to make a deal in Ankara, you're going to make a deal in Kandahar, you're going to make a deal in Badghis, and so where is the influence of Pakistan? So it's not going to work. Pakistan will do everything to stop this kind of local deal. And they can do it. Trust me, if you make a deal right now to the Karzai government, to the US, your life expectancy is, you're dead, basically. See in Kandahar what's happening in Kandahar. For all these reasons, I think that local is not the solution in Afghanistan.
Well, I'll just, there's a couple things. One on the UN negotiating. Again, I'm speaking in my personal capacity, but the UN mandate is, to support the Afghan government. So, if they're working with the Afghan government, there could be a role. The main thing is to avoid the perception that they're doing something independently of that mandate. There can be tensions if people feel that their role is a neutral role, and therefore they're supposed to balance equities between an insurgent group and the Afghan government. So, that would just have to be clearly defined, by the Afghan government and its relation with the UN. In terms of, it's interesting to hear Gilles say that we are not looking at the national dynamics. I know some of the folks in this audience who've worked here have seen quite a lot of attention and focus on the national dynamics, and it's recently that we've moved out and had a lot more attention. I wouldn't say district only, although that is a big focus of the current strategy, but it's district and sub-district, trying to understand a much more nuanced some of the sources and nature of the conflict out there and what our role might be. We have seen, in places like the Khyber Pass and up along Kunar, some pretty good contact with the Pakistanis on certain enemies and trade in ways that I think we can continue to build on. So I'm not as pessimistic as you that Pakistan will not accept localized solutions. They certainly engage in dialogue with their Afghan counterparts along the border. And then I did appreciate the question on sustainability of development assistance, particularly in villages. The main thing on that is we're probably at a point where we've pumped in a lot of money and we've hyper-inflated the economy in a lot of ways, and what we really have to do is transition to Afghan capacity. And folks have referenced it earlier in this session about really a lot of folks have come over that are talented and skilled Afghans. They're now working for NGOs, or they're working for associated with the international community effort. And the idea now is that they'll have to be steered back into the communities so that they can contribute in ways that are entrepreneurial, and ways that they can actually have a more sustainable grounds. And again, different things that are being looked at through legislation in Afghanistan are how to address the timber revenue issue, and how to address things like gems. So that is actually on the table in Afghanistan, because they're cognizant that these industries have to be indigenous and self-sustaining.
Michael, you have a brief last word?
3 last words. On the UN are a bit like the Taliban, great brand. The Taliban brand was the best brand to organize armed opposition against the government. The UN is the best brand to organize peace talks. However, the point is that the current brief of the representative of the Secretary General is to support one of the warring parties. I sort of see it slightly different from Dante. I think there are things that the UN country team can do to sort of prepare the way, a bit of confidence building, but when it actually comes to solving at the national level, it's going to be over their heads. And I think you're going to be requiring people to go back to the Security Council and get a separate mandate. Because the dynamics of it simply do not work. That the administration in Kabul is part of the problem, very much so, as well as being part of the solution. They will not brook any hint of independent action. They will not tolerate the country team having the kind of independence that would be required to mediate the conflict successfully. So when there is a serious attempt to get a negotiated solution to this conflict, we will see the Security Council re-entering the fray and actually giving some kind of a mandate for it. And whatever if we can. It's one of the different great religions. It's like the difference between John the Baptist and actually Jesus. I mean, John the Baptist, very important role, but it's all preliminary. The real thing comes later. So if I'm going to compare them to the Taliban, I can also give them a religious brief as well. Secondly, on the bit about what I mean when I say that in terms of political ecology, the Taliban occupy the space that at other times has been sort of like the clerical wing of traditional Pashtun nationalism. It's because if you study what they say and if you work out what they think, these things have been said before by other people who would have been labelled. So as such, clearly were the clerics in Pashtun nationalism. So if you looked at the kind of stance that Mohammad Nabi took in the politics of Afghanistan of the 70s, you'd find very similar stances to being taken by the Taliban today, although it's a different movement. So it's not meant to be a value judgment. It's about to be trying to understand what are the political instincts, what is the continuity in Afghan political themes, reaching over decades, even preceding the current conflict. And it's important to understand this when you decide, should we be investing $10 million and killing every one of them, or should we be looking for a sort of fresh approach? But then finally, and related to that, on the issue of what's the natural equilibrium, how much of Afghanistan can the Taliban Taliban expect? It depends. I don't think that the Taliban in any ways are naturally the sole sort of political tendency that could mobilize the Pashtuns of Afghanistan. In fact, if we were to look back to the earlier stages of the current process where it might have turned out a bit differently, even if you go to something like the elections in 2005 down in Kandahar, and sorry for looking away from the east, but in the elections in 2005, although there were opportunities for people associated with the Taliban to come into it, Mutawakil, a foreign minister, one of the best known Taliban, did not get a look in because people in Kandahar were organized in a different way and not organized by the Taliban at that period. And I think that when you do think in terms of strategies as to how the political capital that the Taliban do have could work as part of this process rather than against it, probably you wouldn't be looking to them to contest or win elections in those areas. I mean, if you look over towards the east of Afghanistan at the moment, I think it's very interesting that where you get the nearest thing to an almost real elections in Pashtun areas in Nangarhar province, this is the heart of RC East. Although we do have a growing and serious insurgency problem there, that those describing themselves as Taliban, obviously don't get a look in, that we can get actually political clans that have emerged out of the pre-Taliban politics of the area, in terms of important families, important tribes, and important sub-ethnic groups, all have found representation without having to reach for the Taliban. So if Pashtuns were united behind one movement, then of course they'd be grabbing half the country. But how much the Taliban can mobilize depends really on what else is happening.
Thanks very much.